Welcome back to the Captain's Commentaries. Today we'll be finishing out my 3-video series on DMRs by talking about the heavy DMRs. And again, that's just the term I'm using. That is not standard nomenclature, nor am I claiming it should be or will be. But these are the ones that I would classify as the heavy DMRs, the ones that were intended for ridiculous amounts of power, either in their time or today, depending on the era, because technology has improved. And one could argue there was stuff that happened before this, but the one that really jumped out at me, and again, it was the one that was around when I was first getting a hobby, was the long shot. The long shot had an enormous plunger tube, and it was very quickly realized that you could do a lot with it. Heavier springs, eventually, full kits, Orange Modworks kits. I don't actually know where this has got an Omega long shot kit in it. All kinds of kits came out, stainless steel kits and whatnot. Pump grips were created, both originally out of hardware store parts, and then eventually Worker got into making us kits and all of that. And I remember just a ridiculous arms race of people trying to get just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more and trying to get that extra 5 FPS. I want to get it to 300 and then shattering all of their internals and wasting all their money. But this really was head and shoulders over anything that existed at the time. And that's why it definitely, in my opinion, qualified as the heavy DMR for its time. Again, Worker did the same thing with it, where they eventually realized we need to quit making kits for someone else's blaster, because if they quit making that blaster, we've got nothing. And they came out with the Terminator, which, quite frankly, I'd forgotten I even had, because it wasn't great. It had some flaws, but it would take any of the kits that existed for the long shot. And so it was their attempt to, make their own thing. They went with clear. There were some issues with the way the priming rod was designed and some things, but it still had a lot of power for the time. But it was already, I believe, starting to become a little bit on the obsolete side because of our good old friend Captain Slug and his Caliburn. The Caliburn came out and it blew anything out of the water that currently existed, as far as I can remember. Most of what was out there. Had a huge plunger tube, could take huge amounts of spring loads, full-length K26s and all that. Had a really long prime, and since it was 3D printed, was pretty much infinitely customizable. And Captain Slug made the files open source, and so anybody could tinker with it. And if he liked what they came up with, he made it official, or and people could just post stuff. And so all kinds of stuff existed and was created for it, and it was revolutionary for its time. And obviously there were lots and lots of blasters that came out of the concept of a 3D printed blaster. We saw things like the Talon Claw last time, and I talked about the Lynx and various other things. Those all really came as a result from branch down from here, but weren't necessarily improvements on it. They were just variations of some kind. But once again, Worker... Oh, and then, on a side note, Worker, because the Caliburn was so successful and more successful than this, I don't know, timelines might be wrong at this point, but Worker did reach out to Captain Slug, and they did produce a Worker Caliburn. They called it the Holy Sword, I think. And when it first appeared on various websites, the hobby lost its mind because they thought that they had simply stolen it from Captain Slug. Now, Captain Slug was already allowing anybody who wanted to print Caliburns to print them, but it was all people within the hobby. Well, this was, Worker, this big company from across the seas, was stealing Captain Slug's stuff, and there was, people were getting their pitchforks and their torches, and they were going to go after him. And poor Captain Slug had to go to every single Facebook page in the entire hobby and inform them, no, it's licensed, they're paying me, please buy it, I can't print enough of them fast enough. And so they then made some iterations on that Captain Slug couldn't do, like injection molded magwells. That was something that was just beyond his ability to create. 3D printing is all well and good, but it has a lot of limitations. It was never intended for end products. It was always intended for rapid prototyping. You could easily test something and get all the minutiae worked out before you spent the money getting something milled or injection molded, because those processes are very expensive to get started. And that's why pretty much nobody in our hobby has done so. Even Out of Darts doesn't get things like the Jupiter injection mold, because it turns out it just isn't worth the money for the number of them that he sells. And so that was their first use of this concept, their first foray into that. But then again, I think they realized, why are we doing it this way when we could do it better? We have the ability. And so they came out with the Swift. And the Swift is simply it's an injection molded Caliburn. You can just, it just is. It almost makes it look like the Caliburn is the skeleton of a Swift, because in many ways it is. I mean, all of the bits are on the outside of this thing for the most part. There is no inside. Now, people have 3D printed shrouds that kind of cover all of this, and they make it look a lot better, but it is all still 3D printed, which again, as we said, has its limitations. It's more fragile, it's susceptible to heat. There are obviously materials you can print out that are better, but they're never going to be as good or as good looking or as svelte as injection molded. And so the Swift is very clearly part of this evolution and was the first truly, in my opinion, absolutely amazing production quality heavy DMR. And it had all the bells and whistles you could want. It does have easy spring removal by removing that cap where the tool for it is stored on the blaster. Brilliant. Picatinny rail. It does have quick teardown. You can get thumb screws for it. I like the grip. It doesn't have Picatinny rail under here, so there isn't an easy way to replace this grip. Though I'm sure there's 3D printed ones that then give you Picatinny rail and you could put a vertical foregrip if that's your preference. I prefer the horizontal foregrip, so that doesn't bother me. There's top rail for it. There's all sorts. There's different barrel lengths for it. Replacement internal parts to get metal parts, metal trigger, metal bolt. I think that's no chamber, whatever. There's a lot of good parts for it, and multiple springs, and you can get these things up to absolutely ridiculous numbers. I've heard people getting them up to 500 FPS, which is insane. But it's easy to get it up to 300. In fact, it's fairly hard to get it down both to the 150 mark in order to be able to use it in a lot of stuff, because that wasn't what it was designed for. This was clearly intended for high-end stuff. And I appreciate that. But again, it is absolutely built on the R&D that was done for the Caliburn, which is built on the R&D that came out of the long shot tinkerings from back in the day. And then the latest one we have is the Mark IV. And the Dark Zone Mark IV it's a Swift. It just is. It's a Swift. They fool nobody. And if you look at the internals, they are suspiciously similar, almost. But again, that's because well, you could argue that it's a ripoff of the Swift, but you could also say that it is simply built off the R&D of the Caliburn, which has always been open source. So for them to build their heavy DMR off of the Caliburn, to me, seems legit, because that R&D was always open source and available to the public. There's definitely a lot of debate that can be had around that, about the legality, the ethical nature of it, the moral nature of it. I would rather not go into that. I have no desire to go into that. I am not a philosopher. I am not a lawyer. I am not qualified to even try to make those kinds of calls. And I would ask you not to get into those debates in the comments, because you're almost certainly not a philosopher and not a lawyer and don't have all the information. I mean, they may actually, for all we know, they're the same parent company deep down inside. I don't know. I don't know, and I'm not bothered by it, because it, to me, shows an understanding of our hobby and a willingness to pay attention to what we're doing and what we want. They have given us a truly heavy DMR. This thing out of the box will only do 200, but it is absolutely engineered to do everything that a Swift can do. It's just a matter of putting in a heavier spring. They specifically did that. They can only give you a 200 out of the box because that's the regulations, the laws for toys say that it can only do 200 or so. But it can clearly do more. So they've given us something that we wanted. Yes, we already had the Swift, but now we have another option. And this is the 4.0, which almost certainly suggests that there will eventually be a 4.1. Just like there may, in fact, someday be a 1.3. For the medium designation. They may continue along that medium line and as well as the heavy line. There's no reason for them to, I mean, well, they may decide to abandon and just go straight into the heavy, but they could also decide, no, we're going to continue to iterate the medium line as well. Now, they will probably continue to iterate their light line and have something that is the, comes after the Striker. So, yeah. My thoughts on it is that it's pretty cool. It has all the same various features. It is easy to get the spring out. It is half dart only. They have abandoned the full-length dart. I already talked about why I think that is a good idea. The backwards compatibility necessary to be able to fire half darts and full darts mean you're never going to fire either of them as well as you could. So the Swift is the same way. It only does half darts, and I think that's the big jump was that they abandoned the full-length darts, because to get it to work with those, you have to compromise your quality. So these are my idea, or what I'm putting down as heavies. Again, there are almost certainly blasters that will also fall into this category that I either forgot exist or didn't bother to pick up off a wall or somewhere. But let me know what you guys think about this concept, you know, the heavy stuff we're seeing as well as the medium stuff. And my opinion is that there are places for either, and I like that the various options exist, because you can get various levels of performance without having to significantly modify things depending on your event. I mean, you could get a Swift and get it to go low, but then you have to go back to high, and there's tinkerings to get it to work low, and tinkerings to make it work high. And if you could just have something that's designed to go low and something that's designed to go high, yes, you have to have more blasters, but the work and time necessary to make one do both might end up balancing out. These are my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are concerning light, medium, and heavy DMRs, and where the hobby is going to go, where you think it's going to go. Where can you go above the Swift? Where can you go above the Mark IV? What things do you think they need to improve on? What things would you like to see? What features do you think are rubbish, and why did they add that? Let me know. Let me know. Thank you for watching.